Hi everyone! I had such high hopes when I first saw this video pop up in my feed. Overall, I think Alex is an excellent advocate for veganism. In every video I upload, I link to his speech, "It's time to go vegan." But my hopes were kinda shattered when it became clear that he wasn't the best person to discuss this topic with beef queen Mikhaila Peterson. If you don't know who Mikhaila Peterson is, she's Jordan Peterson's daughter, who advocates for the lion diet, which consists of only ruminant meat. She supposedly cured her debilitating autoimmune and mood disorders by eating only beef. I don't want any beef with Alex, but I took issue with a lot of things he said and didn't say in this discussion, so let's get into it. The discussion starts off on a good footing, where Alex pushes back on Mikhaila's claim that most people advocating for veganism are just virtue signaling. He points out that it's difficult to determine someone's motives, and you can say this about advocates for any cause. But 13 minutes in, he says this.
The real strength of the vegan movement is against factory farming, right? The reason that I'm sort of getting up on a soapbox, as it were, and trying to proselytize about this kind of thing, vegangelism as it's sometimes called, is really because of the plight of animals in factory farms. If we were still doing farming how we were a few hundred years ago, it would still be an interesting ethical problem to solve. There'd still be, especially if we have alternatives available, there'd be an important ethical question as to whether we have the right to breed animals into existence and take their lives away from them and inflict certain sufferings in their life. But it certainly wouldn't be the forefront of my campaigning. It wouldn't be the main thing that I spend my time doing. It's really about the factory farming.
He acknowledges that there's an ethical concern with animal farming in general, but downplays it by describing it as an interesting ethical question that he wouldn't feel the need to spend much time campaigning against if factory farms didn't exist. In my view, an interesting ethical question is something like antinatalism. While I consider myself an antinatalist, I don't feel the need to spend much time advocating for this position, because I recognize that having children is not an obvious moral evil. Breeding and killing animals for food when we have access to an abundance of plants is an obvious moral evil. I agree that factory farming should be our top priority as animal advocates because of its scope. But to characterize it as the real problem is misguided, because the underlying problem is animal exploitation. He then lays out the many compelling reasons to abolish factory farming, including concerns about animal suffering, environmental destruction, and future pandemics. He weighs all of these things against taste pleasure, and Mikhaila responds with this.
This is where we disagree, and I think this was brought up with some of the people on the vegan side for the Oxford debate. One guy was talking about, how do you weigh pleasure? How do you weigh suffering against the pleasure you experience eating meat? And what I would argue is, especially in America, I think the major cause behind chronic disease is diet. And I think that a plant-based push is going to make people sicker. I would rather see a push towards regenerative farming than towards veganism, because I think those are going to have major health repercussions that we can't foresee at the moment. So it's funny because everybody who's concerned about this is concerned about suffering on some level.
Yes, on an animal suffering front, a regenerative system of farming is infinitely preferable to factory farming. You're still going to run into an ethical qualm when it comes to taking lives that don't need to be taken. I guess I'm a bit more relaxed than most vegans, and I don't even like using the word vegan because people are sometimes upset with exactly how I use the word, how I define it, or the situations in which I think it would be permissible to eat animal products. A lot of people have told me that it's potentially misleading. Really, I just have a commitment to minimizing animal suffering. So I quite simply just grant the conditional, right? If it is the case that this is going to minimize suffering, then that's the right thing to do. Which means that if there were a situation in which the way to minimize the amount of animal suffering was to go and, shoot the elk, then go and shoot the elk and call yourself a vegan for all I care. I'm just interested in the ethics of minimizing suffering here.
That was great. I like that.
I would also grant that if it were necessary to be healthy, eating animals would be at least somewhat justifiable. This is why it's so important to establish that it's not necessary for the vast majority of people, including Mikhaila Peterson. Alex does not do this. Instead, he panders to her and plays into her delusions.
I think we agree more than people think that we do. I mean, your condition is different as well, your situation, I mean to say, because of the fact that, as far as I understand, like the reason why, I mean, it's funny. Your diet will be more restrictive than mine is as a
Oh my
vegan,
gosh, yeah, it's awful.
um, which is quite strange. But of course, there's a world of difference between your sort of average Joe who like eats KFC because he thinks it tastes nice and animals are here for us to kill, bro, and somebody who says, look, I just actually need this to survive and be healthy. Like these are different justifications, and embedded into the definition of veganism is practicability. That's kind of the operative word. So like, of course, if it were going to like, when somebody says it's not healthy to be vegan, the vegan response is usually, well, yes, it is. Like, look at these studies, look at the scientific consensus or whatever. Like vegans generally don't say something like, well, I don't care if it's unhealthy, you have to do it anyway. Right? They say, no, it is healthy, and that's why you have an obligation to do it. But the implication of that, the corollary, is that if it were not healthy, if it were genuinely not healthy and not sustainable for you, then it would be permissible to eat animals. And that's a position that I hold, and I think is a position that's embedded into the very definition of veganism. So if you look at the definition of ethical veganism, look at what it's actually about, it's a lot more sort of inclusive and relaxed, I think, than might be represented by certain vegan activists that you might see on the street screaming about, drinking milk under any circumstances. It's just about minimizing suffering, which most people are already committed to.
This is like arguing with a racist and saying, we actually share a lot more common ground than people think. We both agree that racism is wrong. Like, sure, they may think they oppose racism, but if their beliefs are rooted in racism, they don't actually oppose racism. To say that the majority of people are already committed to reducing animal suffering is just wrong. They may think they are, but they're not actually committed to reducing animal suffering. Commitment requires action. You can say you're committed to your partner, but if you cheat on them, you're clearly not committed. He validates her excuses when he says that her reasons are so much more legitimate than the average person's. In reality, Mikhaila has no rational basis to believe that her all-beef diet is good for her health, or that meat is necessary for human health in general. The evidence points in the opposite direction. Also, if you ask the average person why they eat meat, they'll insist that it's necessary for their health. Few people will admit that it's because it's what they're used to and they like the taste. Mikhaila, like the average meat eater, has illegitimate reasons for eating meat. And unlike the average meat eater, she's propagating dangerous misinformation to millions of people.
You should talk to Diana Rogers, because your argument makes sense if meat wasn't, I think, necessary for health. And I think that there's a lack of studies. I think that the studies are there, and I think Diana Rogers, who's a dietitian, she wrote The Sacred Cow, and she's very interested in regenerative agriculture, regenerative farming. But I think your argument would stand if it was just about taste and if we could get all the nutrients from a vegan diet. But I think that I don't think long-term veganism helps people. And that's like mostly what I've read online, anecdotes, and then studies. I also know that if you put really, really young kids on a vegan diet, that can be really hard on their brain. But if they eat animal products, it's not. So I think your argument would stand true and would be impenetrable if meat wasn't such a health food.
Yes, and of course, you're right that the science is still very much in its infancy, and we must be careful, okay? Like, this is really important. If there is a risk that this is actually really not nutritionally adequate and we're feeding it to children, not really knowing what we're doing and essentially blinded by what becomes ideology, it merges from just a commitment to minimizing animal suffering to an allegiance to vague principles that are sort of followed no matter what, because they're just sort of thought to be true by a community, then we run into problems. As I say, I'm sort of willing to grant this conditional claim that if it's not actually healthy, then not only is it sort of morally permissible to not be a vegan, as it were, but to basically eat the minimal amount that we need to be healthy and still call yourself a vegan. I mean, we could probably do away with the word. It wouldn't be very helpful. But of course, it's worth bearing in mind that if it's the case that we think, okay, well, meat is required for a healthy diet, or at least animal products of a kind, sure, but this, of course, doesn't give us license to overindulge. And it doesn't give us license to procure these products from factory farms. I mean, even if it is the case that we need these products in order to be healthy, there is simply no excuse, none, for what we're currently doing to animals, for what is, as I say, essentially an overconsumption problem. The numbers involved are just like unthinkably huge, especially when you think about sea life, which is just the most incredible. I mean,
Yeah.
sometimes I like to say, I don't quite know how to get it across, so sometimes I just say, since I started this sentence, around 150,000 wild fish have been caught from our oceans, which is roughly 4 seconds. And in the space of 2 minutes, that will have risen to 3.6 million in 2 minutes, right? The numbers involved are huge, but also the lived experience of these animals, pigs forced into gas chambers, cows being separated from their calves. Everybody knows about this kind of stuff.
Okay, first of all, Alex reiterates that factory farming is the problem, yet in the next breath brings up the suffering of wild-caught fish who aren't factory farmed. His message is very contradictory. Second, Mikhaila is factually wrong about meat being a health food, and plant-based diets stunting the brain development of children. Alex's ignorance on nutrition science is a shame, because outrageous claims like this need pushback. It's clear that Mikhaila has no regard for the hierarchy of scientific evidence. She later admits that her claims lack data and that all she has is anecdotal evidence. Here's a clip from the channel Debug Your Brain, suggesting one way Alex could have responded.
Push against her epistemology. So Mikhaila's nutritional evidence in this discussion basically boils down to anecdotes and things that Diana Rogers either said or cited. So one thing you could do here is ask if she would be convinced that plant-based diets were healthy based on a bunch of vegans' personal testimony and the work and word of a single vegan dietitian. I'm guessing she wouldn't be persuaded. Then you could ask her something like, well, imagine if the British Dietetics Association, Dietitians of Canada, Dietitians Association of Australia, the NHS, and the largest group of nutrition professionals in the world, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, imagine if they all had made statements to the effect that vegan diets were unhealthy and that they categorically did not recommend them. Would that be convincing to her? And specifically, would it be more convincing than the word of one vegan dietitian and some vegan anecdotes saying that they were healthy? Of course it would be. But upon admitting that, she'd have to adjust her confidence about the healthfulness of vegan diets, since all these organizations have in fact made statements about vegan diets. The catch is the statements on their websites are more to the tune of, a vegan diet can support healthy living in people of all ages, and you can get the nutrients you need from eating a varied and balanced vegan diet, including fortified foods and supplements.
Alex seems so afraid of coming across as dogmatic that he's defaulting to the enlightened centrist position. Saying the science is in its infancy is incredibly misleading. Just because there is still much to be discovered in the field of nutrition doesn't mean we haven't reached some pretty solid conclusions about what constitutes a healthy diet. There's a reason the largest body of nutrition professionals in the world put out a statement supporting well-balanced vegan diets and not carnivore or all-beef diets. They looked at the preponderance of evidence and came to the conclusion that a well-balanced vegan diet is not only nutritionally adequate for adults and children, it also lowers your risk for chronic disease. And keep in mind, there is no vegan bias in this peer-reviewed statement. The Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics is not a vegan organization. Same is true for the World Health Organization, which classified processed meat as a Class 1 carcinogen and red meat as a probable carcinogen. If the science were still in its infancy, there would be no basis to publish such statements. The term infancy implies that we know next to nothing. This is an offense to science, which I expect from Beef Queen, but not from Alex. Mikhaila brings up the difficulties of living with an autoimmune disorder, and the inconvenience of being allergic to so many things. Alex says this in response.
But yeah, you're quite right. There's one of the PR problems that veganism has is one of being quite unempathetic for a movement that's supposed to be grounded in empathy. I think it's worth remembering this. When I say that veganism is about minimizing animal suffering to the highest extent practicable, people think about, okay, so if you're an Inuit living in northern Canada and it's genuinely really expensive to import vegetables, okay, fine, eat the meat because you can't afford it. But I think we need to be a bit broader in what we encompass in terms of practicability. So I like to encompass things like, for instance, sometimes I get messages from kids who say, like, I really want to try this veganism thing, or at least sort of minimize my diet, but I live at home and my mum cooks my meals for me and she doesn't want to hear it. And they're really stressed out. They're like, I don't know what to do. Like, I can't refuse to eat this stuff. And I'm just like, relax. Like it's okay. Like this is the kind of thing that I think is included in practicability. Like, sure, okay, technically you could like, say, screw you, mum, and steal some money and go down to the shop and buy your own food or whatever. But like, no, I think it's fine. Like you can talk to her about it over the dinner table and say why you're not particularly comfortable with it. And maybe it will get her to change the cooking a little bit. But it's certainly not unethical to eat that food, right? And so the practicability requirement, I think, should be considered quite broadly. And so it would include things like living at home with your parents. It would certainly include things like eating disorders, definitely things like autoimmune diseases, especially if, as you say, you're sort of bedridden and your life is falling to bits. Like, that's pretty much the definition of impracticability, which I like to remind people is embedded into the definition of veganism. So it's all about empathy, and we need to remember that, of course, humans are animals just like any other, and so we need to be empathetic to those too. And understand that people will put their health interests first.
I don't think it's true that vegans often lack empathy for humans. I think a lot of vegans, including Alex, are overly empathetic. If someone is genuinely not in a position to eat a 100% plant-based diet, like a child living with unsupportive parents, I can empathize. But by saying that eating disorders and autoimmune disorders make it impractical to be vegan, he is giving license to so many people to continue supporting animal abuse. I can empathize with someone in an inpatient facility who literally does not have a choice in what they eat. But I would never blanketly say that being vegan is impractical for people with eating disorders, because it's not true. Recovery is totally possible on a vegan diet. Regarding autoimmune disorders, Mikhaila provides no evidence to support her claim that a carnivore diet cures arthritis, or that a plant-based diet worsens arthritis. But oh, would you look at that? There's evidence that a plant-based diet can help alleviate symptoms for people with autoimmune disorders. Alex is enabling so many people in Mikhaila's audience to continue doing what they're doing. And hell, they can call themselves vegan if they want, because they're doing what's practical for them. I don't disagree with his definition of veganism. I think the qualifier as far as possible and practicable is important. However, I disagree with his idea of what's practical, and his disregard for scientific accuracy. Someone can just make the claim that they feel healthier eating meat, and Alex just takes them at their word. I can empathize with Mikhaila's pain. Of course I don't want her to suffer. But why should I be empathetic to her illegitimate reasons for harming animals? Alex brings the discussion back to the majority of people who don't deal with chronic pain or extreme allergies, and posits that they're weighing a minor decrease in taste pleasure against the suffering of animals. Mikhaila says this in response.
If my theory is correct and that people can't be healthy without animal products, and I'm actually putting dairy in a different category because I can't tolerate dairy without getting really bad arthritis and a multitude of issues. So I don't eat dairy or eggs. They both caused issues. But if you do weigh, let's say, the taste of milk, that's what you have on one side, and then the difference between like oat milk and normal milk to the suffering of a cow. Those are on your two sides. What if the problem with reducing your animal intake is actually chronic health problems, and then what you have on one side is an increase in chronic health problems, and then that's suffering compared to the life of an animal? And chronic health problems, like that's a different story, right? But I mean, it's not yes, that useful at the moment to have a conversation about that, because we need more data. I think part of the reason I've been fighting back against kind of what I've called the vegan ideology is because my concern is we have these people who are implementing agendas in major cities, so doing like Meatless Monday and things, without the proper scientific background. So we don't have proper studies on these things. Now, we have studies like, an increase in meat increases your risk of, I don't know, everything, right? Like there's any study out there that you can say it increases your risk of heart disease or et cetera. Most of those studies aren't done isolating meat. They're done combining everything else you eat with meat. So the bun, the pop, like everything. And it would make me feel a lot better if people who are implementing veganism in major cities and saying you have to reduce the amount of meat you eat, even what's been happening in the Netherlands recently with taking away kind of farmers' land, saying you need to produce less nitrogen. And that means you can't farm cows anymore. It would make me feel a lot better if I didn't feel like there weren't studies being done as well. It's like this issue with chronic disease in North America, it's like killing people and reducing the life expectancy of people. And if that has to do with diet and that has to do with animal products, and we're pushing a vegan agenda to minimize animal suffering and to minimize climate change without looking at that part, we are in for a world of pain in like 10 years.
Yes, I mean, potentially. I imagine you probably receive similar concerns about the carnivore diet, about its potential health implications, and that there are sort of maybe like there's sort of a bit of data on this sort of being healthy, but it's
100%.
But it's potentially sort of disastrous in the. I mean, I don't know actually about the sort of long term. Has there been much research into the long term effect of?
There hasn't been any, which is the issue. Like the carnivore diet is ridiculously new, and the anecdotal reports are insane. Like, you have people who lost a bunch of weight, are off all of their medications, and have a disease that was incurable in remission, which doesn't happen, right? You can't do that. There are some people, you hear anecdotes with people who go on the vegan diet too, and they're suddenly in remission. And
yes,
I know, and I think that there's a reason for that. I think that if you reduce the amount of dairy you're eating, or eliminate dairy and eliminate eggs, I think that those can cause a lot of health issues for people. And if you eliminate processed foods, that can make you a lot healthier right off the bat. And that can all happen with a vegan diet, right? And that's something everybody should be doing regardless of what diet they're on.
It's ironic that Mikhaila is so concerned about plant-based diets being nutritionally inadequate, when her diet is horrifically nutritionally inadequate. Her scientific illiteracy is astonishing. I'm not a nutrition expert, but I have a basic understanding of the scientific method and the hierarchy of evidence. All she has is anecdotal evidence, which is the weakest form of evidence. I can agree that a lot of studies out there have poor methodology and don't really provide useful information. I'm all for conducting more studies and raising the standards for publication, so we don't have to sift through so many low-quality studies. But to say that we don't have proper studies on this? We have randomized control trials that isolate meat and control for other variables. We have meta-analyses and systematic reviews. You have anecdotes. Here's a meta-analysis of randomized control trials that looks at red meat consumption and heart disease risk. Some RCTs indicate that reduced red meat consumption results in better health markers, while others indicate that it does not. The study concludes that inconsistencies regarding the effects of red meat on cardiovascular disease risk factors are attributable in part to the composition of the comparison diet. If you replace red meat with refined carbohydrates, you won't see an improvement in health markers. No shit, refined carbs are not good for you. But if you replace red meat with high-quality plant protein sources like lentils or tofu, you will. This is why meta-analyses are above RCTs on the evidence hierarchy. They provide more clarity by combining and comparing results from multiple studies. You can find meta-analyses that cast doubt on the scientific consensus regarding red meat, but keep in mind that the consensus hasn't changed. Studies that call into question the scientific consensus are often straight from the Merchants of Doubt playbook. When the evidence is conclusive, doubt is all they can muster. It's easier to claim that the results are inconclusive than it is to claim that red meat is a health food and we should be consuming more of it. Alex pushes back tepidly, saying there might be potential negative health outcomes to the carnivore diet Mikhaila's promoting, but agrees with her that we should be concerned about a plant-based push from the government. Again, his ignorance on the topic of nutrition science is a shame, because there is strong evidence that we should be moving towards a whole foods plant-based diet, and away from meat, especially red and processed meat. While there may not be studies on Mikhaila's lion diet specifically, nutrition experts strongly advise against it, as fiber and diversity are essential for a healthy gut microbiome.
Yeah, we have to be careful. I think, of course, to be a healthy vegan is going to be more difficult than being a healthy meat eater, at least in terms of sufficiently healthy. So if you sort of just eat vague animal products, if you just like eat some chicken, eggs, few vegetables, this kind of thing, like you're not going to be in great nutritional shape, but you'll be okay. If you take a similar approach as a vegan and you just sort of like eat whatever, you just have like a vegan cheese sandwich and some pasta, you're going to be in a lot more trouble. And so, while, as far as I'm aware, it is possible, certainly for adults, and a lot of dietetic associations across the world are saying that it's you can get all the nutrients required for a healthy living at all stages of life. But you're right, like we should be skeptical of these things, and we need to, especially when it comes to raising children on these diets, we want to be sure, right? We don't want to be sort of like, well, this dietetic association seems to think it's fine, so let's go ahead and do it. It's like, let's really do some research here. But just like the research into the carnivore diet, which you say is like brand new, I mean,
Yeah, it's brand
science
new.
on the vegan stuff is still in its infancy too. Like this is all fairly new, so we do need to be careful.
This idea that it's harder to be healthy as a vegan than a meat eater is unsubstantiated. On the surface, it seems logical because a vegan diet is more restrictive. But if you look at the science, it's not diversity that's important. It's diversity of plants specifically. And it's easier to eat a diversity of plants as a vegan. The two hypothetical diets he compared don't reflect reality. Most vegans, including the ones who don't give much thought to their diet, are replacing meat with beans, vegetables, or plant-based meat, which is made out of beans. Oftentimes, we're replacing like for like, fortified cow's milk for fortified soy milk, turkey slices for tofurkey slices. Not only are these nutritionally adequate substitutions, they're nutritionally superior. They contain the good stuff, protein and other nutrients, without the bad stuff, saturated fat and carcinogens. There are certainly nutrients of concern among vegans who don't pay attention to their diet that aren't necessarily an issue for meat eaters. But the same can be said in reverse. 95% of Americans don't eat enough fiber. That is very concerning. Regardless of whether you're vegan, you need to put some thought into your diet in order to meet your nutritional requirements. And to say that the evidence for a vegan diet is almost as equally lacking as the evidence for a carnivore diet is wildly inaccurate.
So one of the reasons why factory farming exists is because of the amount of animal products that people are eating. It's just like not sustainable to have.
Apparently, according to this Diana Rogers character, apparently if everybody switched to regenerative farming and there was no factory farming, the output would be similar, which I find difficult to believe given how many animals are in factory farms. But I mean, I've asked them, the people who wrote that book, the same question, which was, okay, switching to regenerative farming is all good, but say people do need meat for health and say we need the same amount of meat we're producing, can you do that with regenerative farming? And she thought we could. And part of the reason we could do that is because you can put animals like goats and things on mountainous areas where nothing else can grow anyway, and they can still survive. Right. So you can still be eating plants on like rocky terrain where you wouldn't be able to have other things. So apparently,
yeah, but then I mean,
would still be the same.
But we're talking about somewhere between 80 and 100 billion land animals alone every single year. I must say I'm scared. I mean, I would say that it's certainly possible that, especially if people start eating more healthily and become more aware of their diets and minimizing their meat intake or something like this, that a global regenerative system of agriculture would be enough to sustain healthy living for everybody. But to say that we'd get the same output, I mean,
don't know.
I'm not sure. I'll have to.
Yeah, maybe we need to. I want to ask you about. Oh my gosh, it's been an hour already.
Mikhaila is factually wrong about regenerative animal farming being sustainable, especially if people were to increase their meat consumption, as she is advocating for. Mike the Vegan debunks these claims in this video, which I'll link below.
Pushing for regenerative farming also mitigates the issue that we could potentially be pushing a diet that's going to increase chronic disease, which I think it might. And at least I think we need more studies to prove that it doesn't.
Yeah, I understand that concern. And I think a lot of vegans would be quick to dismiss it with reference to, as I say, like dietetic associations saying that veganism is healthy. It's like we need to take this stuff very seriously. You know, scientific communities being like, yeah, we've done some studies and it seems pretty safe to be doing this to our children. It's like we need to be really sure about this stuff. So although I guess I'm pretty optimistic about the idea of a plant-based diet being nutritionally adequate, I wouldn't want to dismiss those concerns, and we would like to sort of amplify that I care about them too.
Alex says vegans are quick to dismiss the health concerns people have about plant-based diets by pointing to the conclusion reached by the largest body of nutrition experts in the world after looking at the preponderance of evidence. This is funny coming from someone who I'm pretty sure has deployed Hitchens' razor. That which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. When people like Mikhaila make unsubstantiated claims about vegan diets, we could deploy Hitchens' razor and just ask for evidence. But instead, we point to the preponderance of evidence, and this is viewed as a quick dismissal. The way he characterizes these organizations, like, oh, we've done a few studies and it seems safe for children, as if the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics and the World Health Organization don't take the health of children very seriously or deploy skepticism when analyzing data, is pretty audacious. This is the danger of too much skepticism. You enter conspiracy territory or assume a false middle ground position. Skepticism is good, of course, but doubting the scientific consensus as a layman is hubris.
I think that there's a lot of overlap between how you're thinking and how I'm thinking. And I think it all kind of chalks up to, if you could do a vegan diet and be equally as healthy, even if it's more difficult to achieve that, but if you're careful and you can be equally as healthy, then I don't see anything wrong with it. The only reason that I see something wrong with it is because I believe that you're missing key nutrients and I think the only way to rectify that position are to have more studies and properly done studies. So you talked about evidence for the carnivore diet. The only thing that we have at the moment for the carnivore diet is a study that was done basically on self-reported symptoms from people. And so that's going to skew towards people who are already feeling better. And anybody in the scientific community would just laugh at that study. However, it's enough. That's 3,000 anecdotes of people saying, I was really chronically ill and now I'm not at all. And that should be enough for somebody in the scientific community to say, hey, why don't we do a controlled study? We need to do a controlled study. It's not that difficult. You take some people who have autoimmune disorders, you monitor their diet for 6 months and then see what happens. It just needs to happen, right? And then at least we could have a conversation about, wow, there was overwhelming success. This needs to be taken seriously. Or, oh no, this is a one-off. But I don't know what to do without more data.
She's absolutely right that this is what it comes down to, which is why I don't think Alex was fit to have this discussion with her. Someone who is knowledgeable about nutrition science needs to put her in her place. I'm totally with her on getting more data. I would love for someone to conduct a study on the carnivore diet. But her assertion that there is no credible evidence out there is demonstrably false.
And so when people say to me I try to make sure my meat comes from a good source, it's do you? Are we actually on board about this? Because when I ask people, what do you think about this kind of treatment of animals? They say, oh, that's horrible, that's terrible. It's well, let's make some noise about it then, right? Let's stop buying factory farmed animal products. Let's engage in protests.
Wouldn't the right way to encourage people to stop eating factory farmed, to give them alternatives rather than saying just stop? Wouldn't that be a better, even just sales of trying to stop factory farming? If I was going to market that idea, what I would do is, hey, look at what's happening here. This is bad, but look at this farm and what they do. It's only a little bit more. You can order it from this place. It's only a little bit more, and you get to reduce this amount of suffering. And hey, it's carbon negative. Isn't that a better sell than just stop?
It's definitely a better sell. In that, I actually think that this is maybe what we're going to begin to see happening as veganism grows in popularity. The response, there's likely going to be cropping up, at least when it becomes significantly economically viable, because there are enough people who are willing to sort of go vegan. You'll have companies cropping up saying hey, all of the problems that the vegans are raising about this horrible treatment that they tell you about in the footage they show you, here's our farm, we don't do any of that, we keep the calves with the mothers and when they produce their milk, all this kind of stuff, and this is fine. And definitely, as you say, that's definitely going to sell better than only eat plants, so it's definitely going to be more likely to convince people to stop eating meat. And also it is genuinely, obviously, infinitely preferable to factory farming. Of course, when you start really engaging in animal ethics and sort of vegan activism and animal ethics, I see as two totally different spheres. Vegan activism is about, as you say, what's going to get people to stop eating meat, what's going to sort of bring down factory farming, this kind of thing. Whereas animal ethics is this interesting academic study into the nature of pain and what morally matters. Once you sort of engage in that for long enough, you realize that there are arguments to say that even if we're not factory farming animals, there might be good reason not to be killing them unnecessarily. And so you might be committed ethically to the view that, farms that aren't factory farms, that produce so-called sort of ethically produced meat, are are still unethical. They're still, as long as you've got sort of plant-based alternatives available to you. But as I said earlier, that would become almost like more pedantic. It would be kind of like, yeah, like, because sort of taking the life of an animal without its consent is wrong, we should probably be eating plants instead. But it wouldn't be this like huge, obvious moral emergency that factory farming is. So yes, I agree with you that it sells better, but it's difficult for somebody who's ethically committed to the view that essentially exploiting animals is always wrong to advocate for that, right? People have often compared it to other ethical issues, talking about how they want no cages rather than bigger cages, this kind of thing. It's like, if you advocate for incremental steps, you seem to sort of be legitimizing the process.
Mikhaila asks, wouldn't the right way to encourage people to stop supporting factory farming be to give them alternatives rather than just ask them to stop? As if vegans are just asking people to stop eating entirely. We provide alternatives that are nearly identical in terms of taste and texture, and superior in terms of nutrition and environmental impact. And dipshits like Mikhaila Peterson reject these real, viable alternatives in favor of the fantasy of sustainable and ethical meat. To her claim that regenerative farming is carbon negative, again, please watch Mike the Vegan's video. Alex's response is truly bizarre. He says that so-called humane farms are infinitely preferable. Infinitely. I think the correct word here is marginally. Many undercover investigations have shown that conditions on free-range organic family farms are not as they're advertised. But even under ideal conditions, these animals are still bred into existence to be eaten, and their lives are cut short by a bolt gun to the head and a knife to the throat. How is this infinitely preferable? He then makes this weird distinction between vegan activism and animal ethics, as if veganism is about animal welfare and animal ethics is about animal rights. The definition of veganism is a philosophy and way of living that seeks to exclude all forms of animal exploitation and cruelty as far as possible and practicable. Veganism and animal ethics are synonymous. He then makes the case for animal rights, but tepidly, as if he isn't convinced by the argument. It's all very strange because earlier in the discussion, he talks about what led him to become vegan, which was reading Animal Liberation by Peter Singer. Particularly, it was the argument from marginal cases, also known as Name the Trait, that convinced him. He describes vegans who advocate for animal liberation over welfare reform as pedantic, and says that if we were to get rid of factory farms, animal agriculture would no longer be this huge, obvious moral emergency. Name the trait, Alex! Surely, if we were killing humans for food, this would be seen as a huge, obvious moral emergency. What is the trait that humans possess and non-human animals lack that makes killing humans for meat an obvious moral emergency, but killing non-human animals for meat not one? I want to close with 2 small channel shoutouts that I didn't include in my 10 small channel recommendations video. Go subscribe to Debug Your Brain and Total Veganic Futurism. These guys make extremely high quality videos and deserve way more subscribers. This video bridges the divide between utilitarian vegans like Alex, who focus on animal suffering, and deontological vegans who focus on animal rights.
The spirit of what veganism is has nothing to do with the question of deontology or consequentialism. Veganism is about moral scope. Moral scope refers to the set of entities that are considered to have moral status. For example, someone who is racist may have a moral scope that is restricted to human beings with whom they share similar racial characteristics. Someone who is speciesist may have a moral scope that is restricted to human beings and which excludes other beings who are not human. The question of moral scope is entirely independent of deontology or consequentialism. As an example, take the deontological moral rule, do not kill. This seems pretty straightforward, but we could just as easily ask, do not kill whom? Who are we not supposed to kill? Different deontologists would give you different answers to this question depending on who their moral scope includes. Deontology and consequentialism tell us what to do with moral subjects, but they do not tell us who those moral subjects should be. Similarly, veganism does not tell us what to do with moral subjects. All it says is that whatever our moral framework is, its scope must include non-human animals.
A lot of responses to this discussion that I've seen have taken issue with Alex's moral framework, suggesting that the problem lies with him advocating for veganism from a utilitarian perspective. I don't necessarily disagree with critiques of utilitarianism as a moral framework, but my issue with Alex's performance in this discussion has less to do with his moral framework and more to do with his conflicting and soft messaging. Thank you so much for watching. Please give this video a thumbs up and comment down below. Alright, peace out.
Yo, how when me eat them, I wonder when me eat. When me tell them say me no eat no fish, no meat now. How when me eat them, I wonder when me yam. When me tell them say that I'm a vegan man. How when me eat them, I wonder when me eat. When me tell them